Many sports at the elite level are filled with particular body types. Think about basketball, weightlifting, or long distance running. The advantages of some of these are obvious. Height is essential for a game where every inch is an advantage. Being built like a fridge is essential for picking up really heavy things, and you better be light if you want to carry that body for 100 miles. But what about parkour? What body type works best and why? There are countless things to consider. Arm length, torso length, feet size. I'll cover a whole bunch of different body proportions and parts and then finish with the ideal for parkour. First up, chunky/stocky. And this build is really great for things requiring lots of stability, like plyos and sticks. Big muscles, tendons, and ligaments provide big stabilizing forces that hold you in place as you move. And big joints have large, big, flat surfaces joining them together. Think about two big books stacked on top of each other. They're just inherently stable, and this makes it easy to stay in a good, healthy joint position throughout movement. This, in theory, protects better against injuries too, but people with this build tend to do chunkier things, so they kind of counteract each other. And with this build, it's often a little harder to be quick through things like transitions, as things are just often heavier and chunkier, and things like flow may suffer, even if it's just a visual thing. Next up is small/light. This build is great for things like flow and transitions and just general quickness of movement. These smaller joints and bones are just generally lighter, which makes them a lot easier to lift and move about. And their bodies also form naturally smaller levers, which travel faster through the joint's range of motion. However, this build is generally slightly less suited to things requiring heavy stabilization, like plyometrics, for instance. As smaller joints just don't naturally stabilize as well. Think about two smaller, thinner books. This just isn't as stable. Next up is tall. Tall athletes are a lot rarer in parkour for a number of reasons, but one advantage of this then becomes that there's a real uniqueness of movement that you see with being tall. Things really look quite different when tall people are doing things, and it also provides a lot of advantages for max power because you're working with bigger levers and thus can generate bigger forces. However, it's rare for a reason, as it's generally harder to do. The longer your spine becomes, the more opportunity it has for it to get bendy, and not bendy in good ways. Think about all the tall people you've met with shitty posture. The world is really built for people who aren't that tall, and so tall people consistently find themselves bending down to the world and often end up with stooped postures as a result. This sticking your head style forward of movement is just not very good, and you can try this out for yourself. Just try to do a bunch of parkour with your head as far forward as you can, and you'll find very quickly this doesn't work very well. How about just plain old big? Think rugby player or professional wrestler, 100 kg plus. This is challenging mostly because parkour is fundamentally about moving your own weight, and the bigger you are, the more of you there is to move. They're rare for a reason. It's not impossible, it's just hard to do. Next up, shortness, being short. And this is good for a few things, but in particular, I want to focus on acrobatics. Think about flipping two pencils in the air, one long, one short. The short one flips much faster. These shorter levers allow for faster ranges of motions. Think about entering a tuck position. You've got to enter flexion through a whole number of different joints. The shorter those levers are, the faster they can all do that together. And this shortness often also comes with being lighter. And this less mass basically just means less gravitational force pulling you down to the ground, which is really nice when you're trying to be in the air doing a flip. Next up, genetic flexibility. And this is honestly pretty good, because it allows you to get the full range of motion through your joints pretty easily, which gives you both maximum potential power generation, and it does a lot for aesthetic appeal. Having big, broad, dramatic, graceful, long movements just looks good. And it's also obviously really good for any movement that just requires being bendy to do it. Think about like handsprings or gumbies or lache swing release positions. All these movements just require a relatively extreme body shape, and being naturally bendy makes it a lot easier to acquire these positions. However, it can also come with some downsides. The ability to move anywhere as well, the ability to move anywhere. And sometimes those are not very good places, and especially if you don't have adequate support for those positions. Think like 6-year-old gymnast girl being forced to do a really bendy bridge and just doing all of her bending at her lumbar spine, none through her upper thoracic or her hips. That kind of thing is where you can get into trouble. And this also means there are generally just more ways to bail and hurt yourself. When you fall over, your ankle has a lot more range of motion possibilities than perhaps a less mobile person would have. And if you've ever seen someone with severe hypermobility fall over, that's a total disaster. So people with mobility really need to focus on stabilizing and controlling their ranges of motion. And the opposite side of that coin is inflexibility, naturally more just held together joints. These are harder to move and may have smaller ranges of motion and perhaps less aesthetic movement, but they do come with free built-in stabilization, which is good for things like endurance and some degree of injury prevention. And how about broad shoulders slash big chest. And this, unsurprisingly, is great for things involving arms and chests, things like vaults and laches, where they're the primary movers in the movement. The larger the proportion of your total body mass that they make up, the more relative power they'll have. They've just got less other stuff to move around, and these big shoulder blades and chest often come with really big muscle attachments, which make it a lot easier to grow bigger muscles in these places and get more power from them. And they can also be very good for rolls because it's giving you a big surface area to roll over and to disperse that force across. And also flips. It's giving you a naturally high center of gravity, which is what you want for a high rotation. But there are some downsides. It comes with a less easy stabilization. If you think about the distribution and shape of that weight, it's kind of like an inverted pyramid. And this shape is just inherently harder to balance. There's more weight at the top and width and a narrower point down at the bottom. And this can make it more difficult to do like highly technical leg balance style movements as you're just struggling to balance the weight on the top. And the opposite side of that coin, where you end up with comparatively narrower shoulders and wider hips, is kind of great for the opposite things. It makes you really stable just because of the shape in of itself, and works very well for technical leg things, but is disadvantaged for all those arm movements for the same reasons. That lower center of gravity and lack of upper body muscle mass is just going to make things like flips quite a bit harder. Okay, how about leg and arm length? I'm going to start with long legs. These are great for things like running prees and strides. You've just got bigger levers and you're able to cover more ground with each step, basically. These bigger levers also give you maximum force production. Whereas shorter legs are good for anything where your legs aren't touching the ground, because as soon as the legs aren't on the ground, they're not really offering very much to the movement. So things like vaults, flips, etc. all work better if you've got little legs. And there are a number of well-known parkour athletes who fit into this category of having shorter legs. It really does offer a lot of advantages, and you can see that in their movement. If you notice it, it's kind of hard to unsee just how short their legs are proportional to the rest of their body. Long arms are in theory really good for things like swings and vaults because they're longer levers generating bigger forces. But in reality, they often end up as a disadvantage. Long arms are just heavier, there's more of them, and they often act like weights, pulling people down into the ground or pulling them into less than ideal shapes. Next up, we have foot size, and this is kind of interesting because big feet are both a disadvantage and an advantage depending on how things go. If you can't make them work for you, they often kind of end up functioning like clown shoes, causing the person to have very short steps. They're basically prematurely lifting their foot up in front of them because the foot is so long, it's difficult to clear the ground with it. And it means they don't get through the end of their step and get proper hip and ankle extension. But if they can pull it off, it's an advantage because having a bigger foot just means you have more connection to the ground, more ability to stabilize. If you imagine standing on a really big flat book versus on a small book, it's a lot more stable. And that is the disadvantage with having really small feet, is that it's easier to get through your step, but it can be harder if you've got proportionally very small feet relative to your body. So what is the ideal? What combination works best? And what I think is so great about parkour is that it's a varied sport. There is no one best body type. What works for swings doesn't work for strides. What works for strides doesn't work for flips. Parkour just has too many distinctive elements to have one universal type. And that's part of what makes parkour so cool. There are so many different types of athlete in this sport. But with that said, who cares? Do what you want to do. Who cares if your body is made for it? Being suited to what you're doing only matters if you're in the top 0.01% competing against other athletes. That doesn't apply to 99.9% of the people watching this video. Parkour is fun. Just do what you enjoy. But it's still cool to know this, I think. And it's fun because it can help us maybe justify or come up with some nice excuses why our front flips or swings or whatever are so bad, at least until you see Nate Weston do anything at all. And that's kind of the point as well, is that your biomechanics can dramatically change this. Some tall people are really good at flips in spite of the biological limitations. It's much more about using what you've got than what you've got. Look at Eric Mahamechin. The dude is 6'2", I think, and he's just an absolute monster. This is not destiny. This is just biology. Anyway, that's all for this week, guys. I'm pretty busy with real life stuff at the moment, so I'm not sure how consistent I'll be with an upload schedule, but I'll do my best. Thanks for watching this week. If you want to support the channel, you can like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. I really appreciate it. Helps me out a lot. Awesome. Stay tuned.